Thank you, Chair. Chairman Ambassador Shyam Sharan, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. This conference is taking place soon after resolution of the military standoff in Doklam, which engaged a fair amount of attention not only within India but elsewhere as well. So I thought I'll take that as a takeoff point and review the landscape for cooperation and competition between India and China post-Doklam, and also share with you some ideas on what we can do to take this engagement forward. While I do not wish to go into specifics of the standoff, how it happened and how it was resolved, I would like to point out that the Doklam situation, and more so the stridency with which it was handled on the Chinese side, was like parting of a curtain when one could see more clearly certain fault lines in India-China relations and challenges we face in navigating this very important relationship forward. Fortunately, the situation was resolved amicably, for which diplomats of both sides deserve credit. It facilitated Prime Minister Modi's visit to Xiamen to participate in the BRICS summit, and it also set up a very forward-looking meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping. I believe the outcome of the meeting reflected a strong desire on both sides to restore stability in the relationship and ensure that it didn't go off ramp, as there was some risk during the days of standoff. Potentially, this meeting can be a new beginning, but that will not be easy given structural challenges that we face in India-China relations. Unfortunately, the Doklam standoff has negatively impacted on how China is perceived in India, and thereby weakened the constituency for cooperative engagement. The Doklam standoff has also brought across how China is prepared to assert its contested territorial claims in disputed areas through unilateral actions. We understand that a major focus of discussions between President Xi and Prime Minister Modi was on how to prevent recurrence of Doklam-like situations and incidents in border areas. I would point out that we are today faced with an inherently risky situation when it comes to border areas, even though we have very successfully managed peace and tranquility along India-China borders for quite some time now. The question we need to ask is whether we can afford to delay indefinitely meaningful progress towards a boundary settlement on the basis of the agreement, the chair referred to agreement of 2005, or even implementation agreements like the one on seeking a common understanding on the LAC, which would greatly facilitate management of India-China borders and reduce the element of risk which is currently embedded in this border management process. Can we afford to underestimate the risk of untoward incidents in border areas and the consequent damage to India-China relations? I think this is one question we need to address. In a sense, Doklam is a wake-up call. Fortunately, both sides agree that ensuring peaceful borders is an essential prerequisite for taking India-China relations forward. Without peaceful borders, it will become very difficult to ensure that relations remain on a constructive path. If we take stock of where we stand in relations, I believe Minister M.J. Akbar pointed out yesterday quite eloquently that India-China relations are characterized by a high degree of maturity, which is true. We have a very impressive record card when we take stock of India-China relations. In fact, today India and China are more engaged than ever before in the past. And that's a fairly creditable achievement considering all the outstanding issues we are still dealing with. Professor Shah Liping brought out the consular dimension of engagement. As she rightly noted, the people-to-people exchanges are still suboptimal, though moving the right direction. Last year, for the first time, tourist exchanges between India and China crossed 1 million mark. Small number, but good basis to work on. I believe that has become possible partly because of, in fact, relaxation of visa regime we have brought about in recent years. And this is, I would like to point out a few things there. In fact, today, if a Chinese national wishes to come to India, visa is least of concern. During Prime Minister Modi's visit to China in May 2015, we introduced e-tourist visa for Chinese nationals on a unilateral basis without expecting any reciprocal treatment. So today, any Chinese national can apply online for visa without any documentation requirement, which is very minimal requirement, on par with the nationals of any other country, and get visa within 72 hours. So visa, Professor Shah, is not an issue. Even without electronic tourist visa, this is a practice when I was ambassador we had started, and I believe it's continuing. All tourist and business visas are given within 2 working days, and documentation requirements are once again very minimal. We do have some lingering issues, especially with regard to conference visa. I don't want to go into that in this forum presently. But by and large, for ordinary person wishing to come to India, visa is no longer a constraint. I fully agree with Professor Shah that the need to expand the network of consulates we have. And in fact, we reached an agreement, we signed a formal agreement about opening an Indian Consulate General in Chengdu and a Chinese Consulate General in Chennai. For reasons which are not very clear to me, the two sides have not been able to implement this understanding, and we need to do that without any further delay, because it's very important that we should have an expanded network of consulates. While these positive developments are most welcome, the fact remains that today India-China relations are suffering from overhang of differences and suspicions. And I would suggest that our relations have entered an even more challenging, a phase which is even more challenging than usual. As Chair pointed out, it's usually a question of how cooperation and competition stack out and balance in our engagement. Today that balance has become very uncertain. And I'm not sure that looking ahead, balance will shift in a positive direction unless certain structural issues in the relationship are handled carefully. Today, issues, and many of these issues are old issues, they have surfaced in public domain. They are being discussed and articulated publicly, especially over last year and plus, which has unfortunately affected the narrative of India-China relations, or directions that this relationship is taking. And a very important point here is what Ambassador Shyam Sharan has already made. I was going to make that point. He has made my life easier, that bilateral issues have acquired a much greater salience today because the strategic convergence that has existed in India-China relations has got eroded. The strategic consensus of 2005, Ambassador Shyam Sharan referred to, both of us were involved in that process. He was Foreign Secretary, I was assisting him as Joint Secretary East Asia. We came to this clear conclusion that our convergences outweigh the divergences. Areas of commonality are far more than areas of disagreement. Unfortunately, today, when the worldview of India and China are no longer on the same page on many issues, especially with regard to the changing geopolitical scene in Asia-Pacific region, that consensus is getting eroded. And that's a serious factor behind the overhang of differences that are referred to, that characterize India-China relations today. Today, China is prepared to deploy its considerable political, economic, military and diplomatic clout to pursue its strategic objectives. It seeks ascendancy in Asia-Pacific region and prefer hierarchical order, as once again I'll refer to Chair, in fact, as he has articulated in his book, How India Sees the World. Now, on the other hand, India will prefer a multipolar Asia and multipolar world. So the strategic objectives of two countries are not in sync. We are no longer on the same page. I think this is one basic strategic dilemma, divergence we must face up to and address. Secondly, under President Xi Jinping's leadership, China is seeking to shape its neighborhood through Belt and Road Initiative and other actions. The BRI has several pragmatic considerations like finding new growth engines for China's economy, but I would suggest that above all, it's a geostrategic play aimed at carving out a continental maritime domain with China as the anchor and central player. Where does India fit into that? Again, that's an issue. You're aware of our reservations about Belt and Road Initiative, and the reservations are only partly due to the fact that China-Pakistan Economic Corridor passes through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. There are other wider issues, geopolitical issues, differences between India and China that need to be acknowledged and addressed. We can't wish them away. Thirdly, the rapid accumulation of power by China, its increasingly assertive behavior, has inevitably led to balancing hedging by countries of the region, including by India. This has generated its own tensions in India-China relations and doubts about each other's strategic intentions. So this, again, another structural issue that we need to deal with. Fourthly, the areas of influence of India and China overlap, and there will be growing competition in the shared periphery, both the land domain and continental domain and the maritime domain. There are growing concerns in India that China is increasingly less sensitive to India's concerns and interests in the neighborhood. Now, how do we navigate India-China relations under these conditions? I believe there is a clear case for recalibrating and reimagining the paradigm of the relationship. Given time constraint, I will not be able to go into my suggestions of what needs to be done. What I'll do, I'll highlight two important understandings which exist between India and China, which happened to have been reached when I was ambassador in Beijing, and which can perhaps be re-energized and worked upon. One is a closer developmental partnership. Here again, I think our chair has already referred to that. Today, India and China are the two fastest growing large economies in the world. As you know, 2030, it is widely expected that China, the USA and India will be the three largest economies in the world. It obviously makes great sense, practical sense for India and China to utilize each other's growth stories. And this was the logic behind closer developmental partnership, which was agreed between President Xi and Prime Minister Modi in September 2014 and developed further during Prime Minister Modi's visit to China in May 2015. But this understanding again is a broad template. How do we implement in practice? We have made some progress, but one major constraint obstacle we run into is huge imbalance in trade relationship between India and China, where our trade deficit to China accounts for 45% of global trade deficit. So getting better market access to China, even incrementally, will be a very important factor which will start changing the narrative in India about China. Moreover, our economic engagement with China is undergoing transition as we reach the limits of the earlier model that relied on increasingly asymmetric trade expansion. Investment, e-commerce and services have emerged as new drivers of growth, as trade in goods, especially our exports, has stagnated. Much more needs to be done to identify and utilize complementarities in two economies, and especially forge production and supply side linkages. Unfortunately, today these linkages between India and China are very inadequate, very limited. Now, a second example I would like to give is again an understanding which we reached between our leaders. This was during Prime Minister Modi's visit to China in May 2015, when he and President Shri agreed that the whole process of simultaneous re-emergence of India and China as two major countries, which will be a defining development of 21st century, needs to be carried out in a mutually supportive manner. And I'll underline that. Mindful of each other's interests, concerns and aspirations. That's the broad, template which is agreed upon. But this template, you'll agree, is only aspirational in its character. How do we translate that template into actual action plan or roadmap guiding behavior of the two countries? I would suggest that the geopolitics of the simultaneous re-emergence of China and India can best be addressed through better strategic communication and mutual accommodation in respect to specific theatres, situation, issues to the extent possible. This will involve substantive and continuous discussions and understanding each other's vital interests while avoiding any expansive definition of those interests. This strategic dialogue should also address and manage major issues and differences in bilateral domain and identify areas of convergence and cooperation. India-China relations are like a moving bicycle. If you don't maintain the momentum, there is a risk of falling down. If we don't keep adding positive content to this relationship, there's always the risk of negatives dominating the agenda of dialogue and discourse, because we do have a whole lot of outstanding issues. So this is very important. Keep adding positive content to this relationship all the time. I'll suggest that the primary objective of the strategic dialogue should be to work out how to manage major issues and differences in bilateral domain, identify areas of convergence and cooperation, once again as we did in 2005, essentially develop a new modus vivendi, an updated template for India-China relations. Looking beyond bilateral engagement, we need to forge a fresh agenda for our cooperation or regional, multilateral, and global issues. Chair referred to our understanding on climate change, how we work closely together on trade negotiations. There again, the consensus is fraying. He has himself talked about in public earlier that how developments leading up to Paris Agreement were so different from what happened during Copenhagen Accord. Paris Agreement was shaped by a side deal between China and the USA rather than an understanding between China and other basic countries. So that convergence which has existed even on these core multilateral issues, where I believe India and China working together on cross-border issues is absolutely essential, needs to be redefined and reimagined. Significantly, India and China still consider this to be a period of opportunity in their relations, despite their differences. Significantly, both have a shared desire to project bilateral relations in a positive light, even though they harbor doubts about each other's strategic intentions. I believe it's feasible and desirable to take India-China relations back to a more pragmatic trajectory. However, this will require reimagining the relationship and devising a new modus vivendi, more in sync with altered objective conditions around us. It's worth recalling that after the Wangtung incident of 1986-87, we had developments leading up to Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China in December 1988, which resulted in a new template for management of India-China relations, which has served us very well ever since. Perhaps Doklam can offer that opportunity, a new beginning, but this will require some fresh thinking and sustained strategic consultations, not only between the two governments, but also across. think tank communities on both sides. Thank you very much.